Hey there Nation, and welcome to the show where we help you to play miniatures wargaming on a budget. It is I, Commander Cheapskate, and welcome to the episode of Cheap Shots, the ultimate series for miniature wargamers who want stunning tabletop quality miniatures without breaking the bank. In this series, we'll show you how to save money on your miniatures painting hobby by using affordable craft paints, budget-friendly tools, and clever techniques. Whether you're a beginner or a seasoned hobbyist, you'll learn how to achieve incredible results without the premium price tag. You don't need expensive supplies to make your miniatures stand out on the battlefield. Follow along as we prove that amazing results don't have to come with a hefty price tag. And on today's episode, we're going to show you guys how to paint up your Delaque, Nacht, Ghouls, Gheists, as well as Piscean Spektors. Same thing with your Psychoteric Worms for your games of Necromunda with a minimal amount of cost. As you can see on this picture, this is the end result what it'll look like, and by following our techniques as well as our tips and supplies, you can end up with a grand total savings of $217.08 when you decide to paint up your miniatures using the Cheapskate method instead of using Citadel as well as Army Painter's method, which will cost you $278.85. So that being said, let's go and talk about how to quickly and most importantly cheaply paint up your Nacht, Ghouls, Gheists, Piscean Spektors, and Psychoteric Worms. Now the first thing you want to do, of course, is to assemble your miniatures, and as you can see in this photo, I actually purchased my miniatures secondhand from my local gaming store. What ended up happening is that one of the players at that store was selling their collection of Delaque miniatures. They had a normal gang box set, as well as I believe some of the miniatures had the upgrade weapons as well, and same thing with the boxes that contain the Nacht, Ghouls, the Gheists, the Piscean Spektor, as well as the Psychoteric Worms. And I was able to get the entire set for about $50. The problem though is that the player had already assembled these miniatures and actually started already spray painting them black and started doing, like I think was trying to accomplish, was a slap chop method of painting. He already dry brushed a lot of his miniatures with grays and whites and was actually starting to paint some of these guys as well. He had some really interesting color choices, so I didn't really have to assemble the miniatures all that much because they're already assembled for me. So because of that, assemble your miniatures any way that you want to, and then from there you're ready to do a primer. Alright, so first of all, you need to prime your miniatures. As you can see, I used two different primers for my miniatures. The first one was Rust-Oleum Flat White Primer. I get this at my local Walmart for about $5.89. And I also use Rust-Oleum Silver Spray Paint, which also costs $5.89 as well. Now, the reason why I like to use a white primer is because white primer has a large impact on the vibrancy of the colors I'll be using on these miniatures. I am doing a quick paint method, which means I will be using an oil wash in order to put the final details on these miniatures. And as a side effect of the oil wash, the colors for the miniatures are actually darkened down and muted by that oil wash by quite a bit. So using a flat white primer will help you to use really bright, bold colors, so that way when the oil wash happens, they'll be muted down to the appropriate tone that I'm looking for. At the same time, the primer is also an important step too, because what it does, it creates a surface for your acrylic paints to adhere to. If you actually take acrylic paint and put it directly onto bare plastic, the slightest bit of friction will cause the paint to rub off your miniature and ruin the finish, so priming is a very important step. I'm also using the silver spray paint on my Piscean Spektors, and I actually decided to change halfway through and prime my Psychoteric Worms. And the reason why is because I plan on making like a metallic, colored metallic look with those two types of miniatures, and I'm using glazing in order to achieve that result. So the first thing we're actually going to paint on these miniatures is the flesh tone. I do apologize, I forgot to take a picture of the base coating for the flesh, so I will explain what I did for these characters. So first of all, for the fight on the far right hand side, I used Burnt Umber by Apple Barrel Paint to give a dark skin tone for that Gheists. I then also used Apple Barrel's Territorial Beige, I also used Nutmeg by Apple Barrel, which also cost 58 cents at my local Walmart, for the Nacht Ghoul arm with the sword. For the Nacht Ghoul arm with the Serpent's Claws, I used Flesh by Apple Barrel Paint, also cost 58 cents at my local Walmart. And for the Gheists with the Psychomancer's harness, I actually painted their flesh in two thin coats of Peaches and Cream by Delta Serum Coat. You can get that at your local Hobby Lobby for about $1.65. Once you put a thin layer of two thin layers of the flesh tone directly onto the miniatures, the next thing you gotta do, of course, is a dry brush. And dry brushing is important because what it does, it creates the illusion of depth on your miniatures. What ends up happening is when you dry brush your miniatures, the erased surfaces of the miniatures actually adhere to the pigments of your paint, creating that illusion of depth while leaving that darker color in the recesses of the miniature as well. Now, unfortunately, there is a side effect when you do dry brushing. brushing, you have this kind of chalky, kind of pastel appearance, but that's okay though. It's going to go away once you get to our oil washing step. So for the fighter that I painted with Peaches and Cream, which is the Psychomancer on the left-hand side, I actually dry brushed them with Apple Barrel's Ivory. For the one I did in Flesh, for the Nacht Ghoul in the center, I used Peaches and Cream for their dry brushing. For the fighter with the sword, I used Flesh by Apple Barrel paint for their nutmeg brown skin, and then for the very last fighter on the far right-hand side, I used Territorial Beige in order to dry brush those details. And once you are done, we're ready to move on to the overcoats. So if you guys noticed in my previous video when I painted up some Delaques, as well as the photo at the very beginning of the video, I decided to paint up my Delaques in a very different color scheme that you usually see from most miniature painters. A lot of miniature painters like to use a dark, shadowy kind of recessed kind of color scheme for their Delaques to represent the fact that they're very stealthy and very creepy and they sneak around the shadows, which is perfectly fine. I mean, it's an artistic choice for your miniatures. The only problem for me though is I found that a lot of people do that, and I wanted to make my miniatures a little bit different than everybody else's. So I decided to go with a brighter pink color scheme for my miniatures, and I decided to base it on the old 1990s heavy metal pictures of Delaques when Necromunda first came out. In that edition of Necromunda, the Delaques actually had these bright khaki and brown colored overcoats, and I thought it'd be kind of a cool way to pay that homage with my miniatures to make them look slightly different than everybody else's. So in order to achieve that result, for the Nacht Ghoul with the Serpent's Fangs on the left hand side, I used Burnt Umber by Apple Barrel paint. That cost 58 cents at my local Walmart. For my Gheist and the Psychomancer's Hunter, I used Moccasin Brown by Anita's Acrylic, which cost $1.99 for that color. For the warrior in the center there with the sword, I used Apple Barrel's Khaki for 58 cents for your local Walmart. And then finally for the Gheist on the far right hand side, I used Folk Art's Burnt Umber, which cost Burnt Sienna, which cost $1.17 as well. And I just put two thin coats of the colors I wanted to be for those coats to kind of make a good solid base coat. And as you can see, it's a beautiful rich brown color. Did the sleeves as well as the long coats themselves. And once again, in order to create the illusion of depth on these great coats, I did a dry brushing. For the warrior I did in khaki, I dry brushed theirs in Anita's Acrylic Taupe Gray, which cost $1.99 at my local Walmart. And for the other three fighters who I did in brown, I dry brushed them exactly the same color, which is Territorial Beige or Apple Barrel paint, cost 58 cents at your local Walmart. Just do a quick dry brushing real quick on the colors that you want to be dry brushed, and we're ready to move on to our next detail. So the next step of the painting process, I actually painted the chest and shoulders of their coats a different color. And the reason why is because the way that these miniatures were sculpted, from the way that I looked at it, it looks like what ended up happening is that these Delaques are actually wearing long coats, but then they put like old Cold War era US Army flak vests over their long coats. Kind of like they're wearing like body armor on top of their trench coats. And I thought like the way that the miniatures were sculpted, it looked a lot like that. So because I wanted to make it look like that's exactly what they're wearing, that they're wearing these really thick flak armor vests over their overcoats to kind of give themselves an additional layer of protection. Now, because I want to make my Delaques a little bit differently, I decided to paint those overcoats in different shades of green. And the reason why is because earlier I worked on Delaques that I did in different shades of blue and with a couple of fighters with green as well. And I want to make these look like these guys can fit organically with the gang. At the same time, I also want to use this green color because it's a complementary color to the earth tones that we're using on these Delaque, and it looks, you know, tactical and creepy and everything else of that nature. So I used four colors. I used Holly Branch, English Ivy Green, Palm Leaf Green, as well as Marsh Green, and all those cost 58 cents at my local Walmart. I just put two thin layers of this directly onto the vest, as well as into the little, I guess you would call the utility belts that they have near the thighs of their, on their thighs as well. I just put two thin coats of that color, and then we're ready to move on to a dry brush. Now, regardless of what color I use for the base coat, for the dry brushing, I use exactly the same color, which was Lime Sherbet by Apple Barrel Paint. You can get this at your local Walmart for about 58 cents. And I just did a quick dusting real fast with the dry brush directly onto these tactical vests. And then from there, we're ready to move on to the next detail. And the next detail on these fighters, of course, are their leather goods. We're talking about things like the belts that they have, as well as some of the straps they have on their harnesses, as well as their boots. So to pick out those details, I put it down two thin layers of Payment Paint by Apple Barrel Paint. You can get it at your local Walmart for about 58 cents. Just to put a good solid base coat on all the parts you want leather, things like their forearm greaves, as well as their boots, the belts, the harnesses on their vests. And once we're done with that, we can move on to a dry brush. And the color I used for the dry brushing was Pale Gray by Folk Art. You can get this at your local Walmart for about $1.17. I just did a quick dry brushing on the parts that we did in pavement, so that way we can see those details and create that additional layer of highlighting on the miniatures. And oddly enough, we actually have a lot of these miniatures completed with, so with that being said, we're going to move on to our metallic colors. So all the metallic colors on these miniatures, I actually painted them all the exact same color, which is Folk Art's Gunmetal Gray, which costs you $1.17 at your local Walmart. Now the reason why I did this is because I plan on using glazing to create this colored metallic look on the miniatures. Ever since I painted up my Spire hunting party for my channel using glazing to create that colored metallic look. I've just been really addicted for the way that that looks, and I just really wanted to apply that in a lot more of my miniatures this time around. I use the exact same glazing method for the weapons of my Delaque gang that we did earlier in a previous video, so I want to do exactly the same thing for the weapons and equipment of this set of specialists for the Delaque gang. So I put a good decent base coat of 2 layers of gunmetal gray because I plan on using different colored paints to glaze it on directly onto the metals to create this colored metallic look for the weapons and equipment that they're carrying. The next metallic detail I focus on were on the armor panels on the back as well as the shoulders of the vest that they're wearing. And that's another thing I love about these Delaque miniatures, how they show like this metal plating on their backs to represent the fact that these guys are used to being stabbed in the back, so they have additional protection in order to protect themselves. They're protecting things like the small of their backs, their kidneys, as well as their vital organs. So for those details, I use Folk Arts Anniversary Silver, which costs $1.17 at my local Walmart. Anniversary Silver has a little bit of a blue tinge to it, which also contrasts nicely with the rest of the armor these guys are wearing. So I just picked out those armor panels in 2 thin layers in Anniversary Silver. The next metallic element, of course, I worked on was all the gold elements on these fighters, and I used Deco Art's Emperor's Gold by Deco Art. You can get this at your local Walmart for about 99 cents. And I use this color directly onto the buckles of their long coats. I also use this for the handle as well as the hilt of the sword of the Nacht Ghoul on the right hand side, as well as some other details like their belt buckles on their belts, as well as their harnesses, as well as on their long coats. And once we get those gold elements detailed with, the next color we're going to move on to is to copper. Alright, so the next color, of course, we used was on copper, and we use this for some metallic details on the fighters. So the ones that we actually picked out are these rebreathers that these characters are wearing. They have like these little air rebreather tanks on the small of their backs, as well as on the breathing mask that's located on their collar of their armor as well. I picked out 2 thin layers of Folk Art Copper. You can get it at your local Walmart for about $1.17, and of course just put 2 thin layers directly onto the parts of copper that we wanted done, and then from there we're ready to move on to our glazing. So for this next step, we're going to use a process called glazing. Now how glazing works is what you do is you take your colored paint and you make a 50-50 mixture using this paint as well as water. And what you do is you kind of make it into a wash. And what you do is you apply it like a wash on all parts of the armor that you wanted to be that particular color. Now we actually had to do 4-layer glazing on it. And the reason why this is a nice step is because what ends up happening is that the thin coats of color actually allow the silver undercoat to bleed through, which kind of gives it this shimmering kind of colored metallic look on the miniatures as well. Now there is one problem with glazing. It has an amazing effect when you do it, but it takes forever and a day in order to do so, because what you have to do is you have to apply a layer, let it dry, apply another layer, and let it dry, and you slowly add successive layers of glazing in order to achieve the result that you want. In this situation, I actually used 4 layers of King's Gold by Apple Barrel Paint. You can get it at your local Walmart for about 58 cents as well. Now if you have any situations where you have any mess over or spillover, it's really simple. All you're going to do is take some Anniversary Silver paint and kind of touch up your job afterwards. As you can see in this photo, I kind of did that already. I kind of neatened up the job after I got done with the glazing, because the glazing is kind of sloppy. And so for the other parts of the metallic areas that I didn't want to be yellow, I just kind of brushed it real quick with some Anniversary Silver to neaten up my work. And the reason why that is the case, because I'm going to add some additional colors of detail using Anita's Acrylic Antique Aged Copper. I did this on some of the rivets as well as the joints of the Psychomancer's harness, as well as the little Psychoteric worm that the other Gheists is carrying as well. I just put 2 thin layers of that color directly on the parts that want to be bronzy color. And of course you can get this at your local Walmart, your local Hobby Lobby for about $1.99. Now the next detail we're going to work on are the rebreathers that these characters are wearing. Now if you notice, I used Kiwi by Apple Barrel Paint. It costs 58 cents over the local Walmart. I painted the tubes going up to their rebreathers as well as into the little tanks attached to the rebreathing tanks on the smaller backs. And the reason why I went with this color is because according to Necromunda, they talk about gas, which is a crystalline substance that enhances and awakens psychic abilities within people who inhale it. And I just imagine what ends up happening is that these Delaques actually use this stuff and kind of breathe it in like oxygen, so that way they can open up their minds and expand their psyches, so that way they can use psychic abilities. Kind of reminds me of the David Lynch version of Dune that was released back in the 80s. That film had a beautiful set design when it came to the Spacers Guild. They actually looked like, Delaque. They wore these long black trench coats. They were all pale skinned. They were bald, and they actually breathed in this stuff all the time, and it creates all kind of crazy mutations for them. And I thought it was a really cool look. So that's the reason why I painted that kiwi color, because gas is described as being like this lurid green color. So it's made it look like these guys kind of like take hits of gas all day long, so that way they can become psychically awakened and use their abilities. So next detail we're going to work on now is once again doing another layer of glazing. This time we're using it on the metallic elements on these fighters. So things like the blades of the Nacht Ghuls weapons, as well as some of the feeder tubes going to their serpent's flangs. Things like the cables going from the Gheists in the Psychomancer's harness, as well as the claws of their Psychomancer's harness. Same thing with the Psychoteric worms, like their faces, as well as the little stinging tail that they have in the back. And once again, I did 3 layers of glazing using Mystic Turquoise by Folk Art. You can get it at your local Walmart for about $1.17. It's a beautiful turquoise color that has an awesome job when you do the glazing process with it. The only problem, like I said before, is that glazing takes a while to take care of, so because of that I had to apply like 3 or 4 layers directly onto it to achieve the result I wanted. And of course, if I made any mistakes, I just kneaded up with some anniversary silver to clean up the details, and they're ready to move on. The last major detail I focus on these fighters are on their eyes, because the eyes are very prominent on these miniatures. So for the Nacht Ghuls with the Serpent's Fangs, as well as the Gheists with the Psychomancer's Harness, I put 2 thin dots of bimini blue on their eyes to make it look like they were glowing and preternaturally supernatural. The funny thing about these 2 fighters on the left hand side is that they have 3 eyes actually, so I picked out all 3 of their eyes in the exact same color. For the Nacht Ghuls armed with the Shiver Sword, I picked out his eyes in 2 thin dots of green turquoise, so that way it has this kind of nice contrasting glow in his eyes, and it kind of looks really cool as well. And for the Psychoteric worm there on the right hand side, I picked out its eyes in 2 thin dots of True Red by Anita's Acrylic, which cost $1.99 at your local Hobby Lobby. The 2 apple barrel paints I got from Walmart for about 58 cents. And we're going to put these miniatures to the side for now, because the next group we're going to work on are on the Piscean Spektor, as well as on the Psychoteric worms. So the next fight I'm going to focus on is on the Piscean Spektor, and the Piscean Spektor has like this huge brain on the back of it, like it's been wired in. I really like the way that looks with that brain being exposed. It very much reminds me of Neil Blomkamp's films, District 9, Elysium as well. Those films have like this beautiful, like dirty, filthy, grimy kind of biopunk look, where they're like taking cybernetics and just putting it directly in the raw flesh. It has a really cool aesthetic to it. So I want to do exactly the same thing for the Piscean Spektor, because I thought it looked really cool as well. So pick out the organs on the back of its head. I decided to put 2 thin layers of magenta, by Bright Magenta by Apple Barrel Paint. It costs 58 cents at your local Walmart. And oddly enough, as you can see here, because craft paint is kind of thin already, it does kind of like a semi-glazed look to it because of how thin this craft paint actually is. And because you have a good solid base coat of Bright Magenta on the skull, I decided to dry brush it real quick with some Cameo Pink. You can get this at your local Walmart for about 58 cents. And once again, just did a quick dry brushing, so that way you have some darker recesses in the colors in the recesses, as well as the highlights on top of the brain. So the next step, of course, is to do glazing, and once again we're using King's Gold to create this yellowish kind of glow for the armor, and this process did take a while. It took me about 4 layers of glaze to actually do it appropriately, just because there's a large amount of miniatures, a large amount of space, so you had to use a lot of glazing in order to get that done. Now, I will admit, I took this photo after I did my touch-ups. I actually put a lot of glaze on all over the armor panels on these things and let it dry over time, and then afterwards I neatened up with some anniversary silver. The problem is I took this photo after I did my neaten up part. I do apologize for that. I should have showed you what it looked like before I neatened up with the anniversary silver, but you know, hindsight's 2020. So here's a close-up of my miniatures after I neatened up with some anniversary silver. As you can see, I did things like the little joints there on the arms of the Psychomancer's arm on the Piscean Spektor, things like the little nodules that I did on the bodies of the Psychoteric worm. Just put 2 thin layers of the anniversary silver to kind of neaten up a bit to clean it up, and ready to move on to our next glazing color. So the next color we're going to use for the glaze are going to use, once again, Mystic Turquoise by Folk Art, and this time I used it for 3 layers on the faces and the heads of the Psychoteric worms, because that's what I did for the side guys I did earlier. I also applied the same color directly to the face plate of the Piscean Spektor, and after I got done putting that detail on, I also neatened up the eyes a little bit with some anniversary silver, so that way I can use my next color to pick out the eyes on these creatures. And the color I used for that, of course, is once again Anita's True Red, Anita's Acrylic True Red. Just put 2 thin dots of those on the eyes of the Psychoteric worms, as well as the eyes of the Piscean Spektor there on the right-hand side as well. And the next detail we decided to focus on was on the copper pieces on these fighters. As you can see, we have like these little interesting like little thermal vents on the sides of the head of the Psychoteric worms, and same thing on the Piscean Spektor. So to create that detail, I picked that detail out in 2 thin layers of copper paint by Folk Art, and once we're done, we're ready to move on to our very last series of glazing for the Piscean Spektor. Now for the Piscean Spektor, I wanted their Psychomancer's claws to look a little bit different than the Psychomancer's harness being used by the Gheists. So in order to create that illusion, I decided to use Crisp Apple by Apple Barrel Paint to kind of create like this glowing green color. To make it look like the only reason why this Piscean Spektor is being alive is because they decided to inject this thing full of gas to keep it alive artificially with its brain hooked up to this robotic body. So because I took 3 thin layers of glazing to achieve the effects, I did things like the tips of the Psychomancer's claws, as well as the pipes and tubes running between the brain, as well as the, I guess you would say, the processor of the robotic body. And once we got that done, the next thing we gotta do now is an oil wash. So the next step in our quick paint method is to apply an oil wash all over the entirety of the miniatures. Now most people like to use Armor Painter Strong Tone in order to do this step, which is perfectly fine. Armor Painter Strong Tone is a perfect product that does exactly as advertised. The only problem though is it is quite expensive at $32 a can, whereas a $7.99 can of Midwax Poly Shade and Mission Oak will do exactly the same thing, or something similar to it, but a fraction of the price. So what I did is I applied this like a wash all over the entirety of the miniatures, and what this wash does is a couple of things. The first thing that it does is that it seeps into the recesses of the miniatures, bring a lot of those details we couldn't see before. Things like the gaps in the armor panel, the folds of the fabric, those kind of details. The second thing it also does is smooths out the transitions between our base coats as well as our dry brushing. So as you can see now, that pastel kind of chalky texture is now gone because now those layers have been blended together. And the last thing that the oil wash also does too is it also darkens the value of the miniatures in terms of the colors. So you can see the bright, bold colors we used before have now been significantly muted by the poly shading, giving these guys kind of like a grimy, kind of dirty look as well, which is exactly what we want for somebody who's fighting in the depths of Necromunda. Now, because this stuff has polyurethane mixed into it, you do have to let this stuff dry and cure for 24 hours, because once it dries and cures, you're going to have a nice high gloss finish on the miniatures. It's going to protect it from chipping and fading. If you don't like that high gloss finish like I do, just go ahead and just hit it with some matte varnish later on, but of course, that step is optional. In my opinion, when you do an oil wash, you should always do it as the very last step of your painting process. Leave your project alone to dry and cure, and then return to the next day, so that way you just kind of pick up where you left off. And the next detail we're going to work on are on the bases of the miniatures. So as you can see here, I actually used gunmetal gray for a couple of these miniatures. For my Psychoteric Worms, I didn't have to worry about painting the bases because when I sprayed with silver, it actually got to the bases. But for the Piscean Spektor, I had to paint the flying stand with 2 thin layers of gunmetal gray as well as the rest of its base. I did exactly the same thing for the bases of the Nacht Ghouls as well as the Gheists with the Psychoteric Worm. And for the Gheists and the Psychomancer's Harness, I picked out that piece of I-beam that they're standing on, as well as their base and 2 thin layers of folk art. Now for the flight stand of the Piscean Spektor, I actually put 3 layers of glazing on this miniature at first. Alright, I actually ended up using 4 layers total. What ended up happening is I put 3 layers originally on the flight stand, and when I took this picture I noticed that I could see some of the silver still kind of poking through, so I went back later on and added a 4th layer. So I do apologize for that, but you know, I'm not a professional hobbyist. Now once I got that flight stand taken care of, the next thing I did is I applied Crisp Apple Green by Apple Barrel Paint as a glaze on the bases, so that we have this kind of greenish glowing effect. And the reason why I did that is because I was inspired by the H.P. Lovecraft short story, The Call of Cthulhu. In that short story, they talk about these sailors who find R'lyeh, which is the island where Cthulhu lives on, and they talk about this glowing green stone that's all over the place on that island. And because the Delaque have very similar eldritch horror type background in their narrative, I thought it'd be kind of cool to create that same effect on their bases. So because I put 3 layers of glazing directly with Apple Barrel Paint directly on their bases to create this kind of greenish glowing metallic effect on their bases. Now you'll notice the value of the color is quite different for all the fighters. For the 2 Nacht Ghouls as well as the Gheists, their colors are a little bit darker than my worms, and the reason why is because the color of silver that I use were very, very different. And same thing with the base of the Piscean Spektor too. If you notice, it's a little bit muted with the glowing effect, and that's because of the darker metal that was used to paint that base. Because unfortunately, I got these secondhand, so the black primer kind of affected a little bit of it. But that's perfectly fine though, because once I dry brush it though, it's going to look uniformed anyways. So to create that weathered and worn look, we decided to dry brush the bases with a quick dry brushing of lime sherbet once again. As you can see, we still have that glowing metallic green color, but at the same time though, it also looks kind of faded. And at the same time, we also have highlights there as well, which is quite nice. And then once again, we dry brush it one more time with some Anniversary Silver by Folk Art, just to make it look like it's been weathered and worn and like some of the paint's been chipped off of the decking that these guys are standing on. And once we get done with that last dry brush, the thing we gotta do next is to wash the bases. So to wash the bases, what I did is I took English Ivy Green by Apple Barrel Paint. I made a 50-50 mixture with the paint as well as some water to turn into some homemade wash, and I applied it like a wash directly on top of the bases. I think I did 2 layers of washes with this English Ivy Green wash that I made, and that way it seeps into the recesses, it darkens down the valleys a little bit, at the same time brings a lot of those details in the bases that we couldn't see before. And the next step, of course, is to paint the bases on the miniatures. I rimmed the bases in 2 thin layers of Skyline by Folk Art. You can get this at your local Walmart for about $1.17. It's a beautiful grayish blue color that I use for all of these skirmish miniatures in the studio's collection. I just put 2 thin layers around the rim of the bases, and once that's done, we move on to our very second to last detail. Now this next step is completely optional, but I suggest using a matte varnish directly onto your miniatures, and the reason why that is the case is because I don't like that high gloss sheen that's on the miniatures when I do the oil wash. So I just take some Krylon matte varnish spray that I get at my local Walmart. Costs $6.43. I just do a quick once over real quick with the matte varnish to mute down the sheen of that polyurethane. As you see, it's a nice matte varnish. And the last thing we're going to do is put some blood effect on our Piscean Spektor. So as you can see on the Piscean Spektor, I actually put a blood and gore effect directly onto the brain because I like that dirty biopunk type look, as if like this thing's brain was just freshly ripped out of its head and it's still alive and still kind of juicy, for lack of a better word. So in order to do this, most people like to use Blood from the Blood God by Games Workshop, and you know it's great and all, but you don't get very much of it and it dries out very, very quickly. What I like to use instead is a 50-50 mixture using Midwax Polyacrylic Clear Gloss, which is a water-soluble clear gloss that has a high gloss finish, and mix that with some Anita's True Acrylic Red. It makes a beautiful substitute for Blood for the Blood God. And the reason why I like using that effect too is because it's a little bit more expensive than Blood for the Blood God, but I'll never run out of this stuff, and I'll have this stuff to last me for years. So I put that directly onto the brain and let it dry to create this kind of glossy, wet, kind of bloody looking thing on its brain organs. And with that step done, we are now finally done with our miniatures. And as you can see, we have a beautiful tabletop standard, and we only spent a small amount of money in order to achieve this effect. So with that being said, let's talk about exactly what you'll need to buy from both Army Painter and Citadel if you want to achieve the exact same results we did, but using those name brand paints instead. Alright, so this is the shopping list from Citadel as well as Army Painter if you want to paint up your miniatures the same way we did, but using those name brand paints instead. First, you'll need to buy Blood of the Blood God, Rust Gray, Doombull Brown, Ulthuan Gray, Baharoth Blue, Averland Sunset, Militarum Green, Vulcan Green, Longbeard Grey, Fulgrim Pink, Caliban Green, Screamer Pink, Cyberite Green, Cadian Flesh Tone, Morghast Bone, Baylor Brown, Hellion Green, Moot Green, Eshin Gray, Flay One Flesh, Mephiston Red, XV88, and Rekarth Flesh. And all those pots of paint are going to cost you $4.55, which is anywhere between 9 to sometimes 10 times more expensive than what I'm actually using for my cheapskate method. From there, you'll need to buy Pterodon Turquoise, Creed Camo, Wildwood, Brass Scorpion, Lead Belcher, Screaming Bell, Iron Breaker, Croxacor Blue, and Retributor Armor, and all those colors would cost you $7.80 for those. You'll need to buy a can of Army Painter Strong Tone in order to do the quick paint method, which would cost you $32, as well as a can of Mutatorium Varnish for $24 if you want to do a matte varnish. You also need to buy Corax White Spray as well as Lead Belcher Spray, and those cost $24 a piece as well if you want to do the priming like we did. Now, assuming that you're purchasing everything from Citadel as well as Army Painter for the very first time, you're talking about a grand total investment of $278.85 to paint your miniatures the same way we did, but using Citadel as well as Army Painter. Now, when you compare that to the cheapskate method of $61.77, you end up with a grand total savings of $217.08. So there you guys have it. This is how you guys can quickly and easily paint up a squad of Nacht Ghouls, Gheists, your Piscean Spektors, and your Psychroteric Worms, and saving a lot of money at the same time. So if you're looking for a way to save money on the miniatures wargaming hobby, may I suggest switching to cheap craft paints because you can achieve similar results with a beautiful tabletop standard at a fraction of the price. And if you guys have any other recommendations for some cheap products that you could use on the miniature wargaming hobby, please let it know in the comments down below, and if I like your idea, I'll make a video about it and I'll give you credit as well. So that's good for this week, guys. As always, please like, comment, and or subscribe. Your guys' input is valuable to us as always. Also check us out on Facebook, Instagram, as well as blogger.com for all the greatest hobby news related to this channel. I am Commander Cheapskate. That's good for this one. I will catch you guys next one. Peace out and stay classy.